CBS Sports and Football Game Plan draft analyst Emory Hunt joins me on today's edition of Locked On Eagles to take another deep look into the Eagles' 2024 NFL Draft Class.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, Eagles fans? Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. It's a Tuesday edition of the podcast, and it's brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Really excited about today's show. Look, you guys know I've said it a couple times on the podcast. I am over the moon about the Eagles draft class, and we've had about 3 weeks now to digest it, watch a lot more tape, hear what every expert has to say about Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, Emory Hunt. You look at on day 3, I think stealing Jeremiah Trotter Jr., getting Ainias Smith and Johnny Wilson at wide receiver, Will Shipley. I like the undrafted kids they brought in. This is maybe my favorite draft class on paper the Eagles have ever had. Is it my, the draft run that I was the most excited about? Maybe not, because like 2022 you got A.J. Brown. 2016, of course, you get Carson Wentz. So, like, those two moves in a vacuum made me more excited that offseason. But when you look at the draft as a whole, from start to finish, what they did day 1 through day 3, last year was pretty great. You steal Jalen Carter. I did not think you'd be able to get Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith on day 1. I didn't think they'd be able to get also Sidney Brown and Keely Ringo in the 3rd and 4th round, two guys I really liked throughout the process. You trade for DeAndre Swift on day 3. Like, last year crushed on paper too, but this year, again, when it comes to the combination of my guys, when it comes to the positions they took, back-to-back defensive backs in the 1st and 2nd round, they took multiple wide receivers that I really like with different styles. The Jeremiah Trotter Jr. story is so awesome. I was just such a fan of this class on paper. Of course, it has to come to fruition on the field, but I'm over the moon about it, and I don't want to stop talking about the class. So you've heard everything Gino and I have to say basically about each pick. I wanted to get a different perspective, so I brought on longtime friend of CBS Sports and Football Game Plan, who, funny enough, little backstory about this guy. He was the first interview I've ever done as a podcaster when I was in 7th grade in middle school, and this is dating me, but that was back in 2009. Emory Hunt was an up-and-coming football writer for his website that now is huge, Football Game Plan. Emory Hunt had what's the right word? He was extremely gracious enough to join a 12-year-old kid who had not hit puberty yet, and my voice was extremely high. Took the time out of his day. I've been having him on the show ever since. He's with Ross Tucker now on his podcast routinely. CBS Sports does amazing work for the draft. And what I love about Emory, too, is he has an appreciation for the deeper parts of the draft. Day 3, the undrafted free agent class. Like, he's all in on that. So I talked to him about the Eagles' work on day 3. A lot of picks that day. The undrafted kids. Got his thoughts on Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean. Want to get into that conversation now. Emory Hunt of CBS Sports joining me on the Locked On Eagles podcast. All right, joining me now on the Locked On Eagles podcast, one of my favorite guests to have on during draft season every single year. It's Emory Hunt of Football Game Plan and CBS Sports to help me take another look at this Eagles 2024 class that, Emory, I think a lot of people on paper are saying was one of the better draft classes in the NFL. I get skeptical, I love the draft class, but people have said that in the past sometimes, and of course you got to play on the field. But what did you think overall of Howie Roseman's job over the 3 days of the draft?
Man, it's funny because I thought he knocked out the park again this year.
Yeah.
And I've always said, not only is the draft class important, the drafted players, but the undrafted free agents, the 8th round, I like to say, I thought he did a great job there in acquiring talent. So again, when you have talented drafts, you give yourself every opportunity to win a lot of games. And I thought this class exemplifies that as well.
And so, Emory, I think we had a feeling, especially on day 1, that it was going to be offense heavy. A lot of the prospects at receiver, quarterback, tackle were going to go off the board. But were you surprised at how extreme it was that there wasn't a defensive player taken for the first half of the draft? I mean, I thought personally there was zero chance the Eagles would have a shot at Quinyon Mitchell at 22. I thought they'd have to get up inside at least the top 15. I mean, that was incredible to me.
Especially when you think about how teams, how everyone talks about the league, quarterback, tackle pass rusher, right?
Yeah.
And we saw the first pass rusher go at 15, was the first defensive player taken. So yeah, it was shocking to see Quinyon Mitchell or any of the corners still there for Philadelphia. And so, which makes it remarkable that not only were they able to get Quinyon Mitchell, but Cooper DeJean following that was even more impressive, because those two guys you kind of thought would be gone, or at least they were able to get one of those guys in round one, but let alone getting both of those guys in subsequent picks.
Honestly, I felt the same way last year when they took Jalen Carter. Did not think he'd be available outside the top 5, and then Nolan Smith fell into their lap at the end of day one. I don't know, Emory, was it just a product of that fact that the NFL was just going very offense heavy, and that's why Mitchell and Terry and Arnold, Cooper DeJean were available at the end of day one, early day two? Or do you think this was maybe the league saw it as a weaker cornerback class compared to like the Surtain Horn class or Sauce and Stingley? Like, how did you see that? Why the board fell the way it did?
I feel like everything kind of can be true at the same time. Even though we saw Kool-Aid McKinstry going round 2 to the New Orleans Saints, that's another guy I thought was going to be a first-round pick based off how he played over the course of his career coming from that program. So if you're Philly, it's a great situation to be in, because what I thought were their biggest needs going into the draft, they were able to knock it out the park with their first 2 picks, because we know, you have solid veterans in Slay and Bradbury, but we saw what happened when they got banged up, and age maybe a factor for Slay, so they needed to get younger. You thought, okay, they were going to get maybe one good player at the position, but they got 2 at the position that they needed. So it kind of worked out where you got talent plus fit. It was a great fit for Philly.
How did you personally evaluate Mitchell and Arnold, and even Nate Wiggins was a first-round pick at corner, compared to some of the past few classes that have seen a pretty quick turnaround on corners being pretty good in their first and second year? Like, did you think Mitchell and Arnold were up to snuff for that tier 1 kind of guy, or again, do you think it was a weaker class?
No, I had 80 and above grades on all of those guys you mentioned. So Arnold was my number 1 field corner, and boundary corner, and then Quinyon Mitchell was my number 2, and only a half-point grade was the difference. So I had high grades on all of those corners, so they could have. So in my opinion, 80 or above is a first-round type talent.
Okay.
So if you think about Wiggins and Arnold and Mitchell and DeJean, all those guys had 80 and above grades. You plop them in any draft class, I would have felt comfortable taking them in round 1. So I thought, again, the value was there. The talent was there, and it was shocking to see corner, which, when you expect all the receivers going in round 1, man, when these corners going to go, because they got to cover them. And I thought this was a unique year to see elite tackles, 6 quarterbacks, receivers go, and then corners are still there. Elite corners are still there at the back end of the first round. Was still remarkable.
Well, and especially, Emory, when you see all these teams just loading up on weapons, the Chicago Bears have this trio of receivers. The Eagles have them. I mean, San Francisco, the list goes on. You would think the corners would go earlier, but I think the Eagles are pretty happy with Quinyon Mitchell falling into their lap at 22. Some people, I think they scout the helmet sometimes, and they see that he played at the MAC. He played at Toledo. Is there any kind of fairness in evaluating him based on the school he went to? For me, I don't see it, but what's your thoughts on the Toledo aspect of this?
The MAC, a great conference. We always talking about defensive players coming out of the MAC, or, point of attack players with this O-line or D-line, but the MAC has great football consistently, because I think people have to understand, you think about the footprint of the MAC. You're talking about the mid-American part of the country, right? Mm-hmm. So you're talking about states that have great high school football, and guys get developed in that process, and then they go to these schools in the Mid-American Conference and they play really well. They're good football players. Mitchell just happens to be a good athlete in addition to being a good football player. We saw all of those questions that should have been just squashed at the Senior Bowl, going up against top-level competition consistently and holding his own. And we know one-on-ones is heavily slanted toward the offensive player, and he was able to dominate in that regard all week long.
Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying NFL tickets. The NFL schedule comes out tomorrow night. The Philadelphia Eagles They've got some fun games at home, of course. I love going to Lincoln Financial Field every year, but I also like to go to at least 1 or 2 road games. I like to go to some different cities. I love to travel. This year, they play the New Orleans Saints. I want to go to the Superdome. They also play in LA again against the Rams. I'm driving distance to Cincinnati. Maybe I'll go see Jalen Hurts or Joe Burrow. It's all going to be done through Game Time. You can save up to 60% buying last minute for sports tickets, concerts, comedy, and theater with last minute deals. All in pricing. Views from your seat. You can get a panoramic view so you know you're getting on the app a great view on top of the great prices. Game Time is the perfect way to take the guesswork out of buying tickets. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account, redeem that code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first set of tickets. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. What do you think is, and I think corners have adjusted pretty well from college to the pros, but I think, again, some people are saying, can he go from Toledo to now shadowing a CeeDee Lamb twice a year? What do you think is the toughest thing for any cornerback, regardless of school, to adjust to going from college to the pros, if there is one?
Well, just getting used to the spacing. College, the wider hash marks, you're playing a lot more space, right?
Sure,
so in the NFL, you're essentially playing in the classroom. Even though the field is the same, the hash marks makes it feel like everything is in the middle of the field, everything is closer, everything is confined. So having to deal with things happening quicker, that's the biggest adjustment. That happens for any player going from college to the pro game. And so I think people say, can he cover CeeDee Lamb twice a year? Well, can he hold his own in practice? Like, it's not like the Eagles have, MAC receivers, on the other side. They got elite talent. So he's going to get coached up and trained up by the dudes on the other side of the ball in his own facility.
Trial by fire for sure for Quinyon Mitchell this year. Emory, one more thing on corner before I want to get into some day 3 and undrafted players with you. Cooper DeJean, again, I think a lot of people would have been okay with him at 22, and they could have made the case that he could be a boundary CB1 or CB2 in the future. It's what he did at Iowa the majority of his time there, the vast majority of the time. But because they drafted Mitchell, they have some flexibility now where they don't have to play him on the boundary. Do you think his ceiling can be better reached as a Brian Branch type of do-it-all safety slot star kind of player, or does he adjust better at the NFL level on the outside?
I feel like I graded him as a field corner, so I already see him as a guy that can play off and drive on the ball, right? So whether you say field corner, boundary and field, to me doesn't apply to the NFL. It just applies to the college game and how I grade him. But I feel like he should play corner until he fails at corner. So let him play corner, let him play on the outside, let him do what he does. You want him around the football. And we know the Eagles needed the depth there in the secondary. As the season went on, we saw how hurt they were in the secondary and how detrimental that was. So, yes, DeJean can play on the outside. If you want him to mirror and match on the inside, he could do that as well. I feel like you could put him back there at defensive back and just let him play defense, right? So I just want him to play corner and prove he can't play corner before people start saying safety.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. All right, real quick with you, Emory. Day 3, the Eagles, I'm very surprised. Jeremiah Trotter Jr., an awesome story, of course, because his dad's an Eagles legend, but I was surprised he was available in the 5th round, despite some of the physical limitations compared to some of these other prospects. Like, I thought he was still a day 2 pick. I heard you say, I believe on another podcast, he was your linebacker 1 in this class. Is that right?
He was my inside linebacker 1.
Yeah, and so for you think he can overcome some of the size or athletic, maybe, I don't want to say liabilities, but compared to like an Edgerrin Cooper, he might not be at that level.
Yeah, Cooper is more explosive, more dynamic athletically.
Yeah.
And Cooper was my number 2 outside backer.
Okay.
But when you think about someone like Trotter, I like how Trotter thinks. I like how he plays instinctive football. I like how he is in coverage. I like how he's able to make a play on the ball in the passing game and also play downhill in the run game, run and chase type backer. So I feel like this is a good pick for Philly. Someone that, can come in and play. I have a higher grade on him that I had on Nakobe Dean. So I feel like this is someone that can definitely be an inside presence for Philadelphia, who we know don't draft inside backers in round 1, but they got 2 good ones currently on the roster.
And Emory, I feel like TJ Edwards, who used to be an Eagles linebacker, kind of changed the way I looked at some prospects. I think sometimes I'd get too caught up in physical traits, but you're right. I think high IQ, good positioning. Like that kind of stuff is so important, especially if you're a green dot middle linebacker. Even in the modern day NFL where they want athletes at this position, like I still think there's a role for a guy like Trotter.
How often you found yourself watching the Eagles game in the last 3 or 4 years
Right.
and seeing backers be out of position? And if
point.
they were
Pretty
in
much every
position,
year.
if they were in position, like, man, if he was right there, he would have made that play. You don't have to worry about that with Trotter and a guy like Dean who tends to be where they need to be, and that's what you want mostly. Because if you're in the right spot, you're gonna make the play. But being in the right spot is more important to me at the pro level than the physical attributes. Because we've seen a lot of athletic guys not be in position and they don't make any plays.
Got one more for you, Emory. Johnny Wilson was somebody I was fascinated with throughout the draft process, seeing him at the Senior Bowl, Florida State, 6'7". This guy is he's a giant for sure. And I like taking chances on these unicorn type prospects later in the draft, like to have one or two elite traits. I think it's worth taking a chance on that kind of guy. But with Johnny Wilson, like a lot of receivers don't look like this anymore in the NFL. What is his ceiling at this level?
I think he can be an inside guy. Okay. I graded him as an inside receiver. So kind of that tight split, that nasty split, as they like to call it, 4x4 off the line. You think kind of like a Marcus Colson that can play over the middle of the field, can be a vertical threat. I'm talking about inside the red zone, but he's going to have to really hone his skills consistently and play that physical game because they're going to ask him to bang a lot over the middle of the field. And I think that's where he's going to have the biggest room to grow as a Philadelphia Eagle.
Emory Hunt of Football Game Plan and CBS Sports joining me on today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. You can find him on Twitter at FBallGamePlan. Emory, as always, man, appreciate you coming on the show, and hopefully we can talk soon. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and the NHL. The conference finals are coming up soon. These series are starting to heat up. FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own during the playoffs. Right now, new customers get $150 back in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 back to bet on spreads, money lines, player props. I love a good playoff player prop, all that and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. For me, my shots are going over to the Oklahoma City Thunder. They're tied up 2-2 with the Dallas Mavericks. Of course, the Mavericks have the two stars, Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. A lot of the player props go to the two studs, but for me, I've been nailing those overs on Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Bet on the Thunder, bet on the Mavericks, whoever in the NHL and the NBA with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, Eagles fans, welcome back into this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Guys, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Got to turn down the volume because of all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news. Streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to wrap up the show the way we're going to be doing this for the next couple weeks with some fun, I would say, side quests for the podcast, some mini games during the dead zone of the offseason. Of course, tomorrow, though, we're going to be focused on the Eagles' schedule, which does officially release at 8 p.m. Eastern time. Of course, we're already getting some leaks across NFL circles for some of the biggest games. We know the Eagles are going to open the season in Brazil on Friday Night Football against the Green Bay Packers. That's kind of cool to me, Friday Night Football to kick off the season. I kind of like when the Eagles play on, when they won the Super Bowl. I loved when they played Thursday against the Atlanta Falcons. And then Sunday, you get to just enjoy all the other games because when the Eagles are on at 1 o'clock, if they win or lose, sometimes that dictates my emotional state. Sometimes I don't want to watch the rest of the games if they get trounced week 1, like in 2020 against Washington. Or if they win, of course, it makes the day great. However, if they play later on in the day, like a 4:25 national game or Sunday Night Football, Monday night, I'm still really just thinking about the Eagles game. I can't fully enjoy the rest of the NFL slate until I know the Birds game is over. So I like the Friday night slate. Tomorrow, Gino and I will dive into 3 segments on a podcast all about the schedule. But lately, we started this yesterday. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about just the Eagles passes I normally do nowadays, during the dead zone. What kind of content can I make through Eagles history? Because that's one of my favorite things to do as a NFL analyst. I feel like I consider myself a historian for sure. It's something I'm very interested in. So I came up with a fun game. It's called First Thought. Gino and I started it yesterday. So we're going to bring up 2 past Eagles. We want to give the first word that we think of and then elaborate on it further. So Gino's not on the show today, so I have a friend that's a diehard Eagles fan as well. I told him to pick 2 random Eagles for me and put together this little Canva display that we used yesterday. And he did not tell me the 2 players he took for me to talk about today on First Thought. So I'm going to pull those up now. I have them both saved. So for the audio listeners, I apologize. Give me a second. I'm going to share my screen with our YouTube viewers. And let's see who the first guy. Okay. Here's the first guy, ladies and gentlemen, for today's First Thought. And it's wide receiver Greg Ward. Very interesting. Greg Ward, the first thought I had when I just saw number 84 was hero. Greg Ward is a hero. 2019, this team saw Deshaun Jackson go down, Nelson Aguilar go down, Alshon Jeffrey go down. Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert, sure, you still have those guys at tight end. You got Miles Sanders in the backfield. But the Philadelphia Eagles were desperate for wide receiver help, and they were a couple games under 500. It felt like the season was lost, a season that once had Super Bowl aspirations, and suddenly Carson Wentz caught fire. And who was his go-to target at this position? Maybe even the go-to guy in the clutch on third downs, as much as Zach Ertz was, or even maybe more than Dallas Goedert. It was Greg Ward. I mean, I will never forget that comeback in D.C. against Washington, where Greg Ward mosses Josh Norman with 30 seconds to go, the go-ahead score. Like, there's not many buzzer beaters in football. Like, that's why I like the NBA so much. I love those last-second shots as regulation ends. Like, that's why I like a good game-winning field goal or a game-sealing interception. But I like when the clock almost expires. Like, there's less than a minute to go. Like, this is basically the game-winning play. And we haven't had a lot of that in Philadelphia over the last few years. Greg Ward, though, in 2019, like that was a buzzer beater where, and this is an undersized receiver, he just went up and picked the ball out of midair. And that's a pretty good corner historically. Like Josh Norman wasn't great in 2019 for Washington like he was in 2015 with Carolina. But to just post this guy up who's taller than you and bring down the football in the clutch. Like Greg Ward made so many big plays in that 4-game win streak to clinch the NFC East. Like you look at all the plays in that do or die game against the Dallas Cowboys late on national television on Fox. You look at the game against New York on Monday night. You look at the game against New York week 17 to close out the division. Like Greg Ward was Carson Wentz's go-to target. And this guy just, I love everything he stood for. I even have a Greg Ward hoodie that I've worn on the podcast before. He was with the Eagles from 2016 all the way up until 2023. Like this guy lasted 7 years despite constantly getting released, constantly being placed on the practice squad. He had to go to another football league. Remember I think it was called the AAF. It was that new football league back in 2000 and I think it was 18 and 19. Right before he came back to the Eagles in 2019, he was in a different football league. Worked his butt off there, made plays in a different semi-pro league. It's a pro league, but it felt like semi-pro from a talent perspective. And then Greg Ward comes back and he's making plays on a playoff football team. And then the guy just kept working. He got replaced instantly in 2020. I mean, he's still kind of a go-to target, but they brought in Jalen Reagor. They brought in Quez Watkins and John Hightower. They traded for Marquise Goodwin. Like, they tried to instantly replace Greg Ward. They brought back Deshaun Jackson and still had Alshon Jeffrey on the roster, but the guy just kept working. He never complained. He never demanded anything. And he was a great leader, veteran influence for Jalen Hurts and for a young receiving core. Greg Ward, to me, I would call him a hero. Like this guy in 2019 stepped up, and he's been with the Eagles for a very long time. He's a free agent now, but he got a ring in 2017 on the practice squad. Even guys back then like Torrey Smith and Alshon, those veteran leaders, when they saw what he did in 2019, they're like, yeah, that's not surprising. Like this kid made plays in practice all the time in his early years with the Eagles. And he's a converted quarterback too, played quarterback in college. Like Greg Ward is a cool story. Not everybody's going to be a star in the NFL, but Greg Ward should be proud of the career he had. I'm a big fan of number 84. All right, let's see what my guy pulled up for the second player. Of course he did this because he knew, okay, here's the first word, the first thought for my next guy. Let me pull this up again. I apologize for our audio listeners. I know this is great content for you. Okay, so here we go. It's cornerback from 2017 to 2019, Mr. Ronald Darby himself. And here is my first thought when it comes to Ronald Darby. Public enemy number one. Like, he's public enemy number one for me. You guys remember, for 3 years, I complained about this guy on the podcast. And Ronald Darby, look, Howie Roseman made the right move, trading a third-round pick in Jordan Matthews for Darby back in 2017. He was only, 23 years old. His rookie year in Buffalo, 2 years before that, he was a Defensive Rookie of the Year candidate, fast, good hands. Like, that's the kind of corner that you want to invest in. That's the kind of corner I want right now, and that's what they have in a Quinyon Mitchell. Like, the logic behind getting Darby made sense. However, you also drafted Sidney Jones in the second round, and we know now he was a bust, but at the time we thought this is a top 10 corner, a top 10 overall pick corner that you got in the second round because he tore his Achilles. There was very high expectations for Ronald Darby. You spent a third-round pick on Rasul Douglas, who you guys knew was my favorite player on the team. I loved his ball skills, his length, his aggression. Rasul Douglas, every time he was on the field, made plays. Those were two guys I wanted to see the Eagles see through the development of. You also had Avonte Maddox in 2018. You drafted in the fourth round, had a great rookie year and a playoff run. Ronald Darby, yes, people can think of his career in Philly fondly. He was the starting corner for a Super Bowl team, made some big plays in that playoff run. You look at the next year, too, like the game-winning pass breakup in the back of the end zone against Julio Jones. Like, talk about a buzzer beater. Darby had some good moments, but the dude could never stay healthy. And I think he always underperformed. Like, he constantly got burned on sluggo routes. He never really lived up to the hype of his physical abilities. And yet, Jim Schwartz just refused to trust the other guys compared to Darby. Like, did not give Rasul Douglas a fair shot. And now Rasul Douglas is a really damn good cornerback in the NFL. Sidney Jones had his ups and downs. He couldn't really stay healthy either. But I remember in the beginning of 2018, the beginning of 2019, they just never fully committed to seeing through the development of those guys. Like, the organization clearly, or maybe the coaching staff, maybe it wasn't the front office, but the coaching staff believed in Ronald Darby or trusted him more than the other guys, and I never understood it. If the other guys were just such liabilities on the field, like they were, I don't know, who's a terrible Eagles corner in the past? I mean, Bradley Fletcher. If one of these guys was Byron Maxwell or Bradley Fletcher and Ronald Darby was 2022 James Bradbury, okay, I clearly understand, but the gap was never that significant between Zool and Darby, and yet Darby kept going out on the field. Like that Week 2 game against the Atlanta Falcons on Sunday Night Football in 2019, the dude got shredded, and he just kept ending up back on the field, and it always drove me nuts. So people remember Lou on the podcast in 2017, 2018, 2019. If he talked about Ronald Darby, normally it was not in a positive light. Public enemy number one for me is what I instantly thought. But, I mean, again, I'm being a little dramatic. Darby was fine. And for a third-round pick and for Jordan Matthews, again, this was a starting corner on your Super Bowl roster. But I'm struggling to even be positive about Darby because even in the Super Bowl, the minute they moved Gronk to the other side away from Jalen Mills, Ronald Darby was one of the guys that Gronk started to eat up. And, of course, it's not a fair matchup for Darby as an undersized corner. But I don't know, just very inconsistent. I just don't think he ever really met the ceiling in Philadelphia. And yet the coaches just always put him on the football field. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. Gino and I will be back tomorrow to talk all things Eagles schedule as it is released at 8 p.m. Eastern time. Stick with us. As always, thanks so much for making us your first listen each and every day. Thanks for downloading. Thanks for watching and listening. And let's go, Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.
Appreciate you, man. Thanks for having me.